Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast where we explore all things reproductive health, rights, and justice. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and I'll be helping you stay informed around issues like birth control, abortion, sex education, and LGBTQ issues, and much, much more. Giving you the tools you need to take action and fight back. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, rePROs. Welcome to an emergency episode of rePROs Fight Back. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and my pronouns are she, her. So y'all, I'm going to keep the intro really short this week because we want to get to the emergency episode. But it is also really important that we talk about this week. This week is the 6th annual Black Maternal Health Week. And it is so important that we are talking about these issues. We already know that the maternal health crisis is a huge crisis in the U.S., but we also need to remember that the maternal mortality rate for Black women is 3 times the rate for white women in the United States. And there are multiple factors that are contributing to these disparities, such as a lower quality of healthcare, structural racism, implicit bias from healthcare providers, and underlying chronic conditions. It is so important that we are having this conversation this week and raising it up in any way we can. And there is great conversation that will be happening on social media all week, so make sure to check it out. You can check out hashtags Black Mamas Matter or Black Maternal Health Week, also rePRO Justice, or also hashtag BMHW23. Make sure you are following those conversations and listening to Black women and providers and amplifying those takes and doing what you can to take action. This is a really important week of action. Please, please, please make sure you are as involved as you can be. All right. With that, let's turn to this week's emergency interview. Y'all, you have no idea. I am so excited for this week's conversation. I have Mark Joseph Stern with Slate on to talk about all of the stuff that happened on Friday around Mifepristone. And if you aren't familiar with Mark Joseph Stern, you should definitely check out his writing on Slate. He is definitely one of my go-to writers to check out when there are things happening around the courts and rePRO or LGBTQ rights. Trust me, he is one of those people I turn to without a doubt every time when I need to understand what is happening. It's a trusted source for me. So I'm so excited to have him on the podcast to talk about everything that happened. So with that, let's turn to my conversation with Mark. Mark, before we get started, can you introduce yourself and include your pronouns?
Hi, I am Mark Joseph Stern. I'm a senior writer for Slate covering courts and the law. I have 1 dog and 3 birds, and I am he, him, his. Thank you so much for having me on.
I am so excited to have you here to break down the utter chaos that was Friday.
It was extremely chaotic. I was actually out to dinner with my husband when the decision came down, and the food was just being served to our table. So I had to sit on my phone rudely for 10 minutes and then box it up and race home in terrible traffic. It was not great, but was it ever going to be anything else?
Right? Like,
exactly.
Was he never not going to drop it on a Friday night?
Yeah, I mean, how many gifts can Judge Kacsmaryk give us? Like, the lawlessness isn't enough. He also has to schedule everything in the worst possible way. I think he wanted to get it out before Easter weekend, and mission accomplished.
Okay, I guess let's start with the terrible. So the Texas ruling, what the hell happened?
I mean, like, where to start? By my count, there are at least 12 discrete reasons why this decision is wrong, just as a matter of law, just obviously incorrect. And I think one of the places that's best zeroed in on here, and a good place to start, is this issue of standing. Because, it's 2023. These plaintiffs are in a federal court asking for the suspension of a drug, Mifepristone, that was approved by the FDA in the year 2000, 23 years ago for those who struggle with math. And so, one of the big hurdles that the plaintiffs had was how to explain why they had standing to sue, why they were injured by this approval that happened 23 years ago, and why they waited 23 years to bring a claim in the first place. And what they said was this. So they couldn't find any women who claimed to have been harmed by mifepristone, which I don't know if that would have worked, but it was like better than the theory that they concocted. Instead, they brought forth these doctors and a doctors association that was formed specifically for the purpose of this litigation in the district where Judge Kacsmaryk sits so that he would have jurisdiction. And they said, look, we think we may one day treat a patient who is prescribed mifepristone by someone else who then has a negative reaction and comes to our practice for treatment. And thus we are injured by the FDA's approval of mifepristone 23 years ago because we might treat these hypothetical women, and that is sufficient to establish standing. Look, that is emphatically not enough to establish standing. That is a heretofore unheard of rule. It is insane because the Supreme Court has said over and over again that you have to have a personal and particularized and concrete injury. You have to be harmed. You, not a third party, and you can't just stack hypothetical upon hypothetical and create some causal chain that may eventually lead to you experiencing an injury. It has to be imminent or have already happened. But these doctors just said, well, it might happen one day, so we have standing to sue. And Judge Kacsmaryk agreed and granted them standing on those grounds. And I think, like, in some ways, this may be, oddly enough, because this is kind of technical, people don't often think about standing, this is like the biggest crazy red flag about the decision. And here's why. If Judge Kacsmaryk is correct, then it means that any doctor in this country can sue the FDA for approving any drug that might harm a patient of theirs if prescribed by someone else, by another doctor. And they can walk into court and demand its suspension nationwide, no matter when it was approved. And here, to be super clear, there is a 6-year statute of limitations on when you can file these challenges. Again, mifepristone approved in 2000, it's 2023. Kacsmaryk just suspended the statute of limitations with no real explanation. He said, well, they really, really need me to suspend it so I can rule for them, so I'm going to do it. And that means that, for instance, one doctor is an anti-vaxxer, hates the COVID vaccine, goes to Judge Kacsmaryk's court and says, hey, I might one day treat a patient who was given the COVID vaccine by someone else and had a side effect that led her into my office. So you need to issue a nationwide block on the COVID vaccine. According to this ruling, it would be perfectly within a judge's power to do that. And I think that's, like, obviously a red flag because it has no limiting principle. It's obviously a red flag because it's totally unprecedented. Never before has a federal judge claimed the authority to revoke or suspend the FDA's approval for a drug. And it has gotten the pharmaceutical industry way more involved in the matter of abortion than it has ever been before. For years, the pharma industry has tried to stay away from abortion. They've seen what happens when the American Medical Association and other groups got involved. They get smeared by Republicans. They get attacked. Pharma said, we don't want to touch it. You know, there were only 2 companies that even manufactured mifepristone. And now the entire pharmaceutical industry is jumping in because they recognize that this decision is an existential threat to their ability to do anything, because it would lead to an endless and cascading series of nationwide orders blocking various drugs on the totally hypothetical grounds that they might injure somebody else's patient.
Oh my God, that's so much already. And it's like one tiny part of it. And I think the other thing that, like, my brain immediately jumped to, so, like, was starting to screaming of red flags of thinking, like, how this is going to impact the trans community and gender-affirming care, which is, like, the next big target that's obviously coming after abortion. And, like, I could just see them going after those drugs.
100%. And, you know, there's, again, because there's no limiting principle, it's very easy to see somebody else walking into Judge Kacsmaryk's courtroom and saying, well, you know, I might one day treat a patient who had gender-affirming care as a minor and now regrets it or experiences some kind of side effect and wants it to be reversed or detransition or whatever. It hasn't happened, but it might happen, and demand a nationwide block on the prescription of any drugs that provide gender-affirming care. In theory, even a nationwide block on the provision of any kind of gender-affirming care. I mean, this decision is so broad that it would really allow Kacsmaryk to issue a nationwide injunction against any abortion, period, on the theory that it might hurt somebody else's patient. So I think, yes, this is a way to open the door to anti-trans groups, anti-vax groups, anti-woman groups, anti-gay groups, everybody on the fringe right, to step in and get judges to do their handiwork. And that's why I really would love to see this case thrown out on standing before merits. Like, I think courts should address all of it and say it's wrong top to bottom. But I would love to see a really strong decision saying that this standing theory is ridiculous, because otherwise it's going to keep freaking happening. People are going to keep walking into Judge Kacsmaryk's courtroom asking for this crazy stuff. And look, he has crossed the Rubicon. It is now very clear that he will give plaintiffs anything they want. He will manipulate the law. He will twist the facts. He will do whatever he needs to issue a decision in their favor. And the only tool that higher courts have right now at their disposal is to limit his power by saying you cannot even hear or entertain these kinds of lawsuits.
Okay. I was prepared for it to be bad, right? Like, I was real. Like, you knew there was no chance he was, like, going to decide in our favor. Like, it wasn't going to happen. But I just felt like in some ways it was, like, worse than I expected. And, like, shame on me for, like, not seeing some of it coming. But, like, the very much use of personhood language throughout the decision, I should have seen it coming. And, like, but I was a little surprised by, like, how far some of it went and some of the stuff around Comstock as well.
Yeah, so we can pick those apart. But first,
yeah.
I mean, before we even get to personhood, like, one of the wacky things about this decision is how far Kacsmaryk goes outside of the settled science, the settled medicine, even outside the record to justify some of the crazy moves that he makes. So just to give one example, you know, his standing theory is rooted in the principle that people are harmed by medication abortion in the first place. Well, actually, it's safer than Tylenol. It's safer than Viagra. It's safer than antibiotics. It's safer than insulin. The complication rate is incredibly low. The serious complication rate is close to nil. And that's why the plaintiffs were not able to bring any actual women into court or tell any true stories about Mifepristone harming people. It doesn't really happen. And so what he did instead was he cited a study, quote unquote study, that was conducted by the Lozier Institute, which is the super far right anti-abortion group, where basically they looked at anonymous posts on a website about abortion regret and did a word search among this handful of anonymous posts. And through their word search, felt that many, many women regretted their Mifepristone abortions and felt that they created side effects that they did not want. I mean, obviously a pretty self-selecting group since they're going to, like, iregretmyabortion.org or whatever.
Yeah.
But even more so than that, could have been the same person posting over and over again. Absolutely no verification there. And that is a study that Kacsmaryk cited while ignoring 100 plus actual medical studies showing how safe this drug is. But moving beyond that, I think the personhood issue slots right into this category because, you know, personhood for fetuses, so-called fetal personhood, it's always been the end goal of the anti-abortion movement. The more candid members of the movement don't deny that. And what Judge Kacsmaryk did in his decision was cite a few prominent supporters of fetal personhood to basically say that it's law already, to basically establish that the law and the Constitution treat fetuses as full persons with equal protection and due process rights, and does so just by citing this totally off-the-wall amicus brief filed in the Dobbs case by these two very loony professors who are on the far, far, far fringe of, they are not anywhere near the mainstream of legal thought, I'll put it that way. But Kacsmaryk cites them as though they are speaking to a consensus that exists, that fetuses are persons who have rights, and actually leverages that false assertion to justify acting so broadly on a nationwide basis by saying that the fetuses of women that exist today and will exist soon that would be terminated, that they have a legal interest in blocking Mifepristone. And that is, like, I mean, 10 steps beyond where the Supreme Court went in Dobbs. I hate to even give him any credit, but it's the kind of thing that Kavanaugh said that courts shouldn't do in his separate opinion in Dobbs. Like, it really goes way further than the court did. There are probably 3 votes for that on the court, maybe 4, but I really don't think there are 5. And that is another reason why, like, the extremism of this opinion, the bizarro citations, the appeal to these crazy authorities that have no real authority, the strident partisan tone, all of that is going to get Kacsmaryk applause and Amarillo, but it is going to turn off a number of Supreme Court justices who fancy themselves as real judges rather than just activists and hacks in robes. And I think it will ultimately work against his goals here.
Yeah, there's just, again, that ruling was a mess from top to bottom, I feel like.
Well, I mean, we could like keep going through the reasons why. I don't know if you want to.
Is there any other big flag before we maybe talk about Washington?
Yeah, just before we get to Washington, because I think Washington is obviously like extremely important here. I want to just talk about a few other unscientific things. So we talked about like abortion regret. This is a theme that runs throughout the decision, that allegedly women are going to regret their abortions, and so he, as a judge, has to step in and protect them from making those decisions.
So freaking
which is
patronizing.
Incredibly paternalistic and I think really offensive. And then to the Comstock Act issue, which you noted, this is the definition of a zombie law. The Comstock Act was this crazy Victorian era 19th century law that originally banned the mailing of any kind of, quote, sexual materials, birth control, or abortion causing drugs. Super broad, has been partially repealed and interpreted by the courts very narrowly to avoid serious problems of unconstitutionality, including, the very brazen First Amendment issues here. Like, the whole point of the law, first and foremost, wasn't just to target reproductive rights. It was to stop the free flow of information. And Judge Kacsmaryk leverages the law to claim that actually, like, federal law already essentially outlaws abortion drugs, and that the FDA, by allowing doctors and prescribers to mail abortion drugs, is allowing for a federal felony offense that could put all of these people in prison for years. That is largely irrelevant to most of his analysis. What it really is a warning shot, right? It is an effort to tell doctors across the country, I am ready to hand down prison sentences to you. I am ready to start throwing you people in jail if you follow FDA guidance that expressly allows you to mail a medication abortion, because I am reviving this zombie law that no one has read this way for more than 100 years to ban what the federal government currently approves. And I think that's also something that could work against him in court, that, like, it was irrelevant. It was just a screed tacked on to a polemic. And I think it's going to raise some eyebrows about why this judge is talking about fetal personhood and federal felonies. He's clearly not going to stop with medication abortion if he's allowed to continue here. Like, he's got his eye on a much bigger prize. And again, if we take the Supreme Court at its word in Dobbs, if we take Kavanaugh at his word in Dobbs, which is a huge if. That, we can never rely on this court, and certainly not Brett Kavanaugh. Anytime a guy named Brett is protecting your rights, you should be very concerned. But it really just goes way further than the court wanted to in that case. And I think that the justices aren't ready for that step, and they're aware of the extreme blowback that would happen.
And I think the only other thing I would raise with that Comstock part is, like, this case was explicitly about Mifepristone, but, like, when he expands it and, like, focuses on Comstock, that would also impact the Mifepristone, which would be the alternative of right now. If Mifepristone is banned, providers are ready to go to the Mifepristone only regimen, which, again, incredibly safe, effective, World Health Organization approved, like, very safe alternative to the Miso mix. But this Comstock part made me, like, flagged that, oh, he's coming for both.
Totally. Because, all of these providers and blue states said, like, if Kacsmaryk does this and it takes effect, we will immediately switch to meso-only abortions, and they'll still be safe and effective, which is true. There is a slightly higher complication rate, but nothing to worry about in general. But the gist of his Comstock Act analysis is, oh, don't you dare, because if I ban mifepristone and you go to meso-only abortions, I'm going to be throwing your ass in jail, and you are just no longer allowed to prescribe abortion drugs at all. That is the upshot of his decision, which actually goes even further beyond what the plaintiffs asked for.
Which, again, shocking. Okay, let's turn to the kind of good news. So what happened in the Washington decision? Or what was it? That was the one that wasn't talked about as much, so people may not be as familiar with what was coming.
So the Washington decision was, I think we should just put cards on the table. It was dressed up as a true controversy, as a true fight between these 17 blue states in the District of Columbia versus the FDA. But what it really was a preemptive measure to try to conflict with Kacsmaryk's decision, nullify or push back on or limit the scope of Kacsmaryk's decision by creating competing court orders. I mean, that's what was really going on here. And it's not a coincidence that the judge in that case, Thomas Rice, I think it's Matthew Rice. Let me just look that up because I want to make sure I get it right. It is Thomas Rice. Tommy, we'll call him Tommy. Tommy Rice. Thomas Rice decided that he wanted to hear the case and then issue this decision that conflicted with Kacsmaryk's 20 minutes after Kacsmaryk's decision came down. So what was this case? Well, ostensibly, these 17 states in the District of Columbia, I'll just say plaintiff states, they said, look, we like that mifepristone is broadly available now. We like that the FDA has allowed it to be prescribed without a visit to the doctor. We like that the FDA has been allowing it to be mailed without in-person handoffs. But we still think that the restrictions on mifepristone are too onerous to be justified. Specifically, the FDA's ongoing restriction that pharmacies get this very specific and burdensome certification before they are allowed to dispense mifepristone. And so the plaintiff state said, we think that is arbitrary and capricious. We think that the certification requirement is totally bogus. They went to Thomas Rice's courtroom in Washington and sued to get him to suspend the certification requirement so that any pharmacy basically could hand out mifepristone with a prescription, of course. Again, underlying all of this was the knowledge of Judge Kacsmaryk's suit. Everybody knew what was going on in Texas. And 20 minutes after Judge Kacsmaryk's decision, the judge in this case, Thomas Rice, he comes out with this very interesting order where he says, look, I think that the plaintiffs are probably right. I'm going to hold further hearings and adjudicate this case on the merits. But right now, I am issuing an injunction that prohibits the FDA from altering the status or availability of mifepristone in the plaintiff states, 18 in total. And so the FDA, as we speak today, and this may change soon, but as we speak, the FDA is under competing court orders that are mutually exclusive, one of which requires it to effectively suspend or revoke mifepristone around the country in all 50 states and 5 territories. Another of which directs the federal government and the FDA to continue providing and, in fact, protecting access to mifepristone in 17 states in the District of Columbia. The FDA cannot comply with both orders at once. It is under a lot of pressure from both sides. I think because the FDA supports medicine-based science, science-based medicine, it probably wants to follow the Washington order, but it just doesn't want to break the law. And so it is very much stuck in a bind that's going to force the higher courts to step in here and figure out what's what.
Okay. So that all happened Friday. I guess the big question is, this is Tuesday when we're recording this, because I think everything's happening so fast, the timestamp matters. This is Tuesday, early afternoon. What's next? What can we expect this week? Because I know there's a lot that we can expect this week.
So, right. So it's Tuesday, early afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time. By midnight tonight, the plaintiffs in the mifepristone case in Texas, let's just call them the bad guys, Alliance Defending Freedom, Aaron Hawley, Josh Hawley's wife, yes. The bad guys, in short, they are on the clock because the administration appealed the Kacsmaryk decision on Monday. And the Fifth Circuit stepped in and said, all right, well, by Tuesday midnight, the plaintiffs have to respond. So the plaintiffs, in that case, who are the bad guys, are working on their brief right now, figuring out like how they're going to respond to this effort to halt the decision to issue what's called an emergency stay that will allow the continued approval and dispensation of Mifepristone where it is legal under state law. That's what's happening in Texas. We'll see what happens. It all depends on which panel of judges hears this emergency stay application. The Fifth Circuit is mostly crazy. There are some moderate Republicans and a handful of Democrats just going to like use this moment to say there's currently a vacancy on the Fifth Circuit that has sat vacant for many, many months. And the Biden administration has not nominated anyone to that seat, which is really the administration's only tool for moderating the Fifth Circuit. So like, maybe the number one takeaway from all this should be that Biden needs to freaking nominate somebody to the Fifth Circuit so that the court could become a little less crazy. Because if he had already, that person could be sitting on this case instead of a not-so-Trump nominee. But setting all that aside, everybody's on the clock. We'll see what happens. In Washington, it's a little bit different. So the FDA has come in Washington and basically asked for what they call a motion for clarification. And they've said to Judge Thomas Rice, hi, we don't know what to do. We're under competing court orders. We want you to clarify whether we are really obligated and to what extent we are really obligated to protect access to Mifepristone in these plaintiff states, which is kind of a dodge. I don't think I really like that move, but I understand it because I think they're getting ready for the possibility that they will be under these mutually exclusive court orders. And if they have to choose one and they choose the Washington court order, they want to have an opinion that expressly says, you must follow this, not Kacsmaryk, so that they can wave that around. If like, I don't know, Greg Abbott sends some crazy Texas sheriffs to try to arrest like the FDA's leadership, they can say, we have a court order that is requiring us to do this. And nobody can argue that we aren't complying with at least one order, even if that means defying another.
Yeah, and I feel like that leads into some of the conversation we've seen around that the FDA holds the authority here and they don't have to necessarily implement this Texas decision. And I've seen a lot of wordsmithing around, you can't, not saying ignore the Texas decision, but what can the FDA do?
So the FDA has a lot of moves here. I mean, first of all, I would just say like, this has never happened before, right? A judge has never claimed the power to revoke the FDA's approval of a drug or suspend the FDA's approval of a drug. This is totally novel territory. I mean, we just have to see what happens. But what we do know is that the FDA has enforcement discretion to decide how and when and whether to enforce its decisions on various drugs. And there is a very strong argument that even if Judge Kacsmaryk's decision takes effect and the FDA is under a court order to suspend approval of Mifepristone, that doesn't actually have to mean anything in the real world. The FDA can say, okay, like we're signing a slip of paper that says, because of this order, we're suspending approval of Mifepristone, and then just not do anything else. And it's not like Mifepristone is mailed out from a secret chamber in the FDA's headquarters. Like, everything will continue as normal in states where this medication is legal. It's going to continue. People will continue prescribing and taking it. And the FDA can just say, look, we're using our enforcement discretion not to enforce the fact that this drug is technically not approved. And I think what would happen then is the plaintiffs would go back to Kacsmaryk's courtroom and say, we'll issue an order forcing them to do it. I mean, that would also be unprecedented. I'm sure he would do it. He's a Looney Tune. He's insane. He's completely lawless. I mean, he's one of the worst, if not the worst judges in the country right now, and one of the worst judges ever in history. He barely pretends to be a judge. But, you know, even then, like, they don't control the FDA. Like, Judge Kacsmaryk does not control the federal government. He does not sit in the executive branch. He does not have any control over HHS, the FDA, any of these agencies that are in charge. And he cannot single-handedly go to every like doctor and pharmacy that's providing Mifepristone and like stop them from doing it. So I do think, and like I'll say, I have had some conversations with some decision makers in the government about this. And they have said, like, we really hope that civil society And like the medical establishment does what they know is right here rather than caving to Kacsmaryk's decisions, because we can't actually say we're ignoring this decision. We can't say we're choosing to violate it, but we can say that we're using our enforcement discretion. And if we do that, then individuals who are on the good side of this fight need to understand that it's time for them to do their part and continue prescribing Mifepristone as if nothing has changed.
Yeah, I think that also really important right now, again, on Tuesday when we're talking about this, is that the Kacsmaryk's order is stayed for 7 days. So if you have an appointment or anything like that, please keep your appointment. Miffy is still readily available in states where abortion is legal.
And no matter where you live, you can go to aidaccess.org and you will have Mifepristone mailed to your address safely and confidentially, even if you live in the reddest of red counties in Texas. Greg Abbott, Ken Paxton, I hope you're listening to this. Everybody can go to aidaccess.org and get the medication that they need.
Which is right. Which is why the antis really hate medication abortion, is like, you can get it to your door. They can't like protest at a clinic to stop you getting it. I mean, they can, but like now that we have medication abortion, it's more, in theory, more easily accessible to people. And so kind of have to fight harder to get it taken away.
That's why the antis are proposing this idea of measuring the water supply of different towns in places like Texas to see if they can detect Mifepristone, and begging sheriffs to basically start going door to door and searching houses and testing individuals for traces of Mifepristone. And I think, yes, that's one reason why the antis hate it. Like, it's so hard to detect, it's so hard to stop. But I also think there's like a very basic aspect of this that's just misogynistic control over women's bodies, right? Like the fact that women and non-binary people and trans people, all people who can get pregnant, I'm just using the umbrella term, the fact that they can go online or go to a Zoom with their doctor and get this delivered to their door and have total autonomy and privacy, that blows up the antis' heads. They cannot imagine it. They hate it. They want to be able to scream at them on the sidewalks. They want to be able to barricade the doors. They want to be able to do everything in their power to stop this. But because of the fact that it's just a handful of pills, they can't. And that drives them crazy. It makes them lose their minds because they spent so many years exerting severe control over people's bodies when procedural abortion was the number one way to terminate a pregnancy. And now that nearly 60% of the country is using medication, they have lost that control and they know it.
Okay, I feel like I could talk to you about this forever, but respectful of your time, let's not do that. But I always like to end the interviews with actions. So like, I know this is the court decision, so it's a little harder to say what my audience can do, but are there actions my audience should be thinking about right now that they could take?
So, I mean, first of all, I think that people need to hear about this decision and have it explained. If you've listened to this whole episode, I promise you are more than capable of explaining the basics here. Like, you know, read the decision. It's not that long. It's completely off the wall. Get a sense of how crazy it is. Read the parts about where he ignores 100 plus scientific studies saying Mifepristone is safe and then pulling random anonymous blog posts to say it's fake, just to say it's dangerous. And like, arm yourself with that knowledge and talk to your friends and family, talk to your colleagues, your neighbors, like get people activated about the fact that a single federal judge has claimed the authority to essentially ban this drug nationwide, even though it's not an authority he has or one that he can really carry out. Talk to your electeds, talk to your state legislators, talk to your federal legislators, get legislation protecting medication abortion on the floor, formally repealing the Comstock Act so that it's not looming over these cases and like a kind of a loaded gun sitting on the table for people like Kacsmaryk. And, you know, I think there's been a lot of debate about whether people should be stockpiling medication abortion for themselves or their friends. I don't want to incur any kind of panic here. My personal opinion is that Kacsmaryk's decision will be blocked before it takes effect. But look, if people feel like they want that protection, if they want to be able to have these medications on hand for if and when they need them, whether you live in a red state or a blue state, You can go to aid access, right? Like you can talk to your doctor if it'll make you feel more comfortable. Put yourself in a place where this is not like traumatizing you and on your mind all the time, because we can't burn out now. It's very early in this fight. And I think that anything you can do to feel a little bit better and to know that you still got some control here and that you can have an influence here and you can help people, that is like the absolute best that you can do. And donate to abortion funds, specifically in states that neighbor red states like Texas. New Mexico is a great one. They're having to open up a ton of new clinics to absorb all of the patients coming across the border from Texas. Fund those clinics. Go to just Google New Mexico Abortion Fund, and there will be many at your fingertips.
Yes, and it's fundathon right now, so it is definitely a great time to donate to abortion funds. Mark, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated talking to you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Okay, y'all. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mark. I had a great time talking to him about the absolute chaos that was last Friday. With that, if you have any questions, always feel free to shoot me an email, Jenny@reprosfightback.com, or you can always reach out to us on social media, and that's rePROs Fight Back on Facebook and Twitter, or rePROs FB on Instagram. Otherwise, I will see you all next Tuesday for our regularly scheduled episode. Okay, bye! For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit us at our website at reprosfightback.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at rePROs Fight Back and on Instagram at rePROs FB. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends, and please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening.